Camille Cosby will no longer be allowed to remain silent on charges against her husband. A judge has ordered Mrs. Cosby to testify on Wednesday in a defamation suit in Massachusetts. 7 women who accuse Bill Cosby of drugging and sexually assaulting them say he portrayed them as liars when they came forward. Mrs. Cosby's attorneys argued the couple's private conversations are privileged, but the plaintiffs say they subpoenaed Mrs. Cosby because she was her husband's business manager. In addition to this civil suit, there was a criminal bombshell this week. Bill Cosby was arrested and could face up to 10 years in prison on sexual assault charges in Pennsylvania. He's out on $1 million bond at this point in time. Joining me now to talk about this is former LA County prosecutor Loni Coombs. And so, Loni, we want to start with the civil case. And just to be very clear that there is a civil case, this is what we're talking about with Camille Cosby testifying involved in this case. And then you have the Pennsylvania case, which is the criminal case involving Andrea Constand. In this civil case, what questions would you ask Camille Cosby during the deposition?
Well, remember, we're looking at a woman who is not only Bill Cosby's wife, but also his business manager. So she has had a lot of access to what's been going on in both his professional and private life. And some of the questions that the defense attorneys or the plaintiff's attorneys are saying they want to talk about are, did she have anything to do with procuring the drugs that the women talk about? She was allegedly around when some of these assaults occurred. So what did she know about the assaults? And we know from the deposition, Bill Cosby talked about how he would procure these quaaludes for the purpose of and the intent of having sex in combination with the quaaludes. So as his wife, does she know anything about the details of his sexual proclivities? Does she know that he happens to like to combine sex with the quaaludes? There's a lot of information she has access to, which is why the civil judge said, you need to testify in these depositions. You have relevant information, and as dual role, not only as wife, but also business manager, you need to be accessible to the plaintiff's attorneys to be able to talk about these different issues.
So why is there no marital privilege here? I understand why, as the business manager, she might testify to things that were in that scope of things, but it sounds like she's also going to be testifying about things that are within the scope of just what a wife would know. Why is there no privilege?
And this is a great question, and you're going to hear a lot of different comments on this by different legal analysts, because there's really not a firm set rule. In the criminal courts, the privilege applies very strongly, and rarely will you see a spouse, unless the spouse decides to waive that privilege, be forced to get up and violate that privilege. It's pretty much a set rule. You do not have to get up and testify at all. However, in a civil case, the marital privilege is not as strongly accessible. You can be forced to testify. You may be able to be protected from giving some of the private conversations, but you may still be asked about actions or about observations that you had. The other thing is some of the legal analysts will point out and say, look, this is discovery in a civil case. It's not an actual trial. However, we have a big caveat. Now, in this case, we know that criminal charges are pending against Mr. Cosby in another state. Most likely, I would think that his attorneys are going to go into the Massachusetts court and say, hold on, we now have a criminal case pending. Anything that Mrs. Cosby says in these depositions could be used in the criminal court, which most likely she would not be forced to say any of these things under oath. And so we want to put the civil case on hold while we resolve the criminal case first. And many times a civil judge will say that, and they will give priority to the criminal case first.
That's a really interesting point. So we may not actually hear from her for some time, and if we do, it may be after this criminal case has been resolved. When you're looking at just the sheer number of accusers, I think last count it was 57, so it's at least 57 women who've come forward, and they're accusing Cosby of drugging and sexually assaulting them. The statute of limitations has run out on almost all of these, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this doesn't play out in the criminal case, right? Obviously, if the prosecution has their way, they're going to try to create a parade of alleged victims to convince the jury that this is a pattern of behavior.
Absolutely, and this is going to be some of the strategy that we see going on between the prosecution and defense in the pretrial motions before it actually gets to trial. What is going to be allowed in on what we call prior bad acts? prior bad act evidence is usually kept out because we're not allowed to put on something that says, look, this guy has a propensity to do this, so he must have done it in this case. They want the jury to focus solely on the evidence in this case. However, there are exceptions to allowing in prior bad acts. One of which is there's a unique signature to the type of behavior. And in this case, there's an argument that what he did with these women that's been alleged is very similar over and over again, unique behavior. So that's one thing that the prosecution might allege. Another thing, remember, the big issue is going to come down is, was this consensual or not? That's what Mr. Cosby has been saying. He said back in 2005 when he was questioned about this case, he said this was a consensual relationship, that they had a social dating relationship, and this incident was a consensual sexual incident. So perhaps the prosecution will argue and say, look, we should be able to put in these prior bad acts to show there was no consent, and he should have known because he had all of these prior incidents where he did the same thing and the women were not consenting and they were upset and they told him so. So he should have known that this was not consensual. So that's another argument a prosecution make to bring in these prior acts. It's going to be crucial because if the prior acts come in, it's been shown that juries are very strongly swayed by evidence of prior acts, which is why the judge will say he has to weigh out how probative it is versus how prejudicial it is to the defendant.
And the case may hang on that. We will see. Loni Coombs, thank you so much for joining us.